Hello, welcome everyone. Welcome to today's Friday Transportation Seminar. I'm Jennifer Dill, Director of the Transportation Research and Education Center here at Portland State University. And I will be introducing and moderating today's seminar, which is in person for the first time in years. Thank you, everyone who's able to be here in person, and always we welcome everyone who's on the web as well. This is
lower.
All right, I'll just do that. Yeah, so we're doing this like with paper and everything, and not online, sitting at the computer. So our Friday transportation seminars have been a tradition since the year 2000. And for the first time in 2 years, we are pleased to be hosting today's seminar live on Portland State University's urban campus. Portland State is located on the ancestral homelands of the Multnomah, Cathlamet, Clackamas, Tumwater, and Watlala bands of the Chinook, the Tualatin Kalapuya, and many other indigenous nations of the Columbia River. It is important that we acknowledge that we are here because of the sacrifices forced on the indigenous ancestors of this place, remember these communities, and honor their legacy, lives, and descendants. This week's seminar is part of PSU's annual Research Week, a celebration of the researchers who help make our university great. This week-long series of events honors and calls attention to PSU's exceptional research, scholarship, and creativity. Today, we are very pleased to have John MacArthur and Cameron Bennett presenting on using e-bike incentive programs to expand the market, trends, and best practices. John MacArthur is the Sustainable Transportation Program Manager at TRAC at Portland State and an instructor in civil and environmental engineering, teaching on new and emerging technologies in transportation. He is active in research related to sustainable and equitable transportation, particularly in the areas of emerging technology, such as e-bikes, bike share, transit, and the relationship between transportation and public health. Cameron Bennett is a first-year master's in transportation engineering at PSU. Master's student, I missed that word. His work as a graduate research assistant focuses on promoting and facilitating the uptake of active transportation modes. He serves as president of the PSU ITE STEP, the Students in Transportation Engineering and Planning student group, which he's been doing an excellent job leading this past year. He received a Dwight David Eisenhower Transportation Fellowship presented by the U.S. Department of Transportation at the annual meeting of the TRB this year. His passion lies in the promotion of cycling in all its forms through engineering design, planning, policy, advocacy, and community-driven engagement. All right, before we jump into today's seminar, I've got a few things to share about some upcoming things for the rest of spring and the summer as well. So we have some Friday transportation seminars coming up over the next few weeks. Next week, we will be virtual only with Kathy Tuttle. And then following that, we'll have Nathan McNeil and some colleagues from PBOT and TriMet talking about the red lanes, red bus lanes. And then we will wrap up the spring with our wonderful MERP students talking about a workshop project. And then this summer, we have our IBPI faculty workshop, which is a 2-day course supporting transportation planning and engineering faculty in integrating bicycle and pedestrian topics into their courses. And we will be putting links to these in the chat for those of you who are online. And for those of you who are local to Oregon, you may be familiar with our annual summer camp for high school students who are interested in learning more about transportation. We've hosted 158 students over the last 6 years. It is free to attend. The seats are limited. So apply by May 25th. All right, those are all of our announcements. And for those of you who are attending remotely, please type your questions into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. And you are eligible for 1 credit of AICP. We'll be saving the questions to the end. We'll have about 10 to 15 minutes time for questions. And everything is recorded. We'll be posting the slides and the recording online after we are done. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to John and Cameron. I'm a little worn out here. Thank you. Oh, I forgot to do that. Sorry.
All right. Hi, I'm John MacArthur, and this is Cameron Bennett. We're going to be talking about a project that we have been working on related to e-bike purchase incentives. And today we are just releasing a white paper on it. So we'll talk a little bit about the findings of that and some other work that we're kind of doing. So again, here we are. And I want to acknowledge our partners. Both Chris Cherry and Luke Jones are on our project. They are helping out both with this white paper, but also a project that we are launching around understanding the purchase incentives related to e-bikes. And then acknowledge Ash from People for Bikes, both for helping out on the project and providing technical assistance, but also for help funding the project along with NITSE. So we're very thankful for that. And then Cameron is a Eisenhower fellow, so FHWA, we thank you. So here's a little overview of the outline, what I'm going to do. I'm going to be talking just quickly around market overview of e-bikes and benefits, and then Cameron's going to take over and talk a little bit about e-bike incentives in the white paper. Okay, so let's just all get on the same page. What is an e-bike? So we understand that an e-bike is a bicycle. So in most states, it is codified in the rules, both at the federal level, but at the state level, it is a bicycle. It's not a motorized vehicle. It basically, through the regulations, it forms and is regulated as a bicycle. In general, you will see some kind of definitions here. There is a kind of, out of the 50 states, almost like 40 or 35 to 40 have taken on this 3-class system. So when we talk about e-bikes, we're talking about a bicycle that has a motor that's no more than 750 watts or less. It has pedals, so somebody can put human power and move it. It's not like a scooter where you just sit on it. Some have throttle, engagement of the motor, but a lot of them are pedal-like, where you're moving your feet and that engages the motor. And then in the 3-class, these first 2 classes, class 1, class 2, the max speed is 20 miles an hour that the motor will engage and get the bike up and going. And then there's a class 3 that goes up to 28 miles per hour. So that is an e-bike. They come in all shapes and sizes. So we'll be talking a little bit about that, incentivizing and how people will use these different bikes as part of their travels. And basically, we did a little bit of market research looking at the costs of e-bikes, and you might be interested. The average cost of all e-bikes is about $2,500. So a little bit more expensive than your normal bicycle. But also I wanted to point out cargo bikes, the average is about $5,000. So, a typical cargo bike could be this blue one or the orange one, where you might have kids or goods put on the back. So definitely a little bit more expensive than an average bike. So how do we get people to purchase these and why? So where the e-bike market is right now, it's basically the market is shifting from outside of that recreational side of purchasing, people purchasing mountain e-bikes and bikes to just go for nice casual rides, and moving towards using them for utilitarian trips and for actual trips to work and shopping. Like the rest of the world, particularly in Europe, e-bike sales in the United States have skyrocketed, doubled. We're seeing huge growth in the last couple of years, partly because of COVID, but also we're seeing this trend going on before. And you could see dramatic rises of 122%, and we are just over 1 million e-bikes sold in the United States in 2021, and they are outpacing electric vehicles, as a total class. So more people are purchasing e-bikes than they are electric vehicles. So again, the slide on your left shows the total bike sales. So you can see we've seen this for the last, basically decade, where bike sales have kind of stagnated or kind of leveled off, but e-bike sales have dramatically risen. And you can see these are the different types of e-bike, and you can see in the last 3 or 4 years, it's really taken off. Partially, there's more bike models, more of the bike companies, the standard bike companies are actually putting out e-bikes, but also they are much better products. So more people are using them, and they're liking them. And I should notice this slide is only 1/3 of all e-bike sales. It doesn't even include the direct-to-consumer sales that are somebody like Rad Power is a company that sells directly to consumers, or somebody buying over the net, getting the bike to themselves. So only a portion of total sales. So why do e-bikes matter? Well, first of all, they break down barriers to cycling. So we've done some studies that kind of looked at this, why people are purchasing them, and either they're helping people go up hills, they're letting parents take their kids to school, younger people that are using it for commuting that don't want to sweat, carrying heavy goods, and as people are becoming older, it helps break down some of the physical barriers to cycling. So overall they've seen they help break these barriers. Oops. But we also have additional benefits in that they are helping reduce and help meet statewide or city goals. Here on the right, the idea that we are at 6-7% in Portland of our bike mode share, and we want to have an aspirational of 25%. How do we get more people cycling more often? And we've seen that through some of the national surveys and work that we've done, that e-bikes get more people cycling more often. And if you're interested in any of this work, I'm not really going to go into it. There's links at the bottom, both at the Trek site and also the Lever site that I'm participating with, where we have a lot of this information. You can dig a little bit deeper. But we have definitely seen a shift of people using those bikes, particularly shifting out of car trips. And so that reduction of VMT means a reduction of greenhouse gases and its positive benefits. So, how do we get more people riding more often? Well, first of all, increasing awareness about e-bikes. There are programs around the country, lending libraries, getting people on the bikes, those test rides, ride and drives type of kind of experiences. Also doing outreach. Hey, e-bikes are here. How much do they cost? How do you use them? People still have questions around, how do I charge a bike? How do I use it? Also, like in Portland, we have a fully e-bike sharing system. It's another great way to get people aware of e-bikes. I have a friend that was using the Portland bike program and never used an e-bike before, and they were astonished how easy it was, and was, I think that's another way to create awareness. Obviously, selling more bikes. So we're going to be talking a little bit more about incentives and how do we create incentives that can have an equity focus, can use the dollars to incentivize people transferring from e-bikes and hopefully getting out of their cars and traveling in more sustainable ways. Definitely more bikes, different price points. We're going to be seeing that. As we've seen, those averages are already kind of high, but different types of bikes, more types of bikes at different price points is important. And then finally, not related to e-bikes, but we need to create more safe places to ride to more locations. That's going to be another aspect of getting more people participating in cycling. With that, I'm going to transfer over to Cameron, who's going to talk about this white paper. So we just launched it today. You can download it at this link and at the QR code. And Cameron's going to be talking a little bit about that.
Cool. Awesome. Thanks, John. We'll have this QR code up again later, so if you miss it now, we'll get another chance. Yeah, like John said, we just put out this white paper today. The goal of this white paper was to kind of take stock of existing e-bike incentive programs around the US and Canada, and to develop a set of recommended practices for folks who may be looking to develop their own program here in the future. So why e-bike purchase incentives? John's kind of told us that e-bikes have a number of benefits, right? And municipalities are starting to recognize that. There's a great number of cities in the United States that have cycling goals, much like the city of Portland does. And a great way to address those is by promoting e-bikes, right? Because they provide for a much wider range of use cases and a much wider range of users than a traditional bike does. And so in order to achieve these goals, right, these municipalities are looking to promote the uptake of e-bikes because they see a wider market for them than conventional bikes. Purchase incentive programs are starting to emerge in North America as a really popular way to do so. So study questions here as we look forward is, particularly we're interested in how price could be used as a vehicle to promote e-bikes, right? So as we look at a technology adoption curve, right, we can really quickly, for any new technology, see a set of early adopters that are really in on the tech, right, and willing to try these things quickly. But it's really difficult to make that transition over to the majority of people in society using the technology, right? And so e-bikes are kind of at this point where we're starting to bridge the chasm. But price remains a barrier for a lot of people to enter the market. And so using pricing tactics could be a great way to start to kind of bridge that gap. And in order to answer this question, we're looking at the current trends in the e-bike programs and trying to figure out the best practices for administration of these programs looking forward. So for our study, we did a policy scan of all of the existing programs that we could find. This was largely conducted using Google search and Google News alerts, as well as digging into the program websites, chatting with the program managers at a handful of these programs, and then doing a literature review of some of the existing incentive philosophies. So from the inventory, we found 75 existing programs, 38 of which are active. Importantly, we're seeing a bunch of proposed programs that are sitting in the legislature, kind of waiting to matriculate out into society. And then what we were really interested in here was these 37 active or closed programs that have some sort of a cash subsidy involved with them, right? So a whole lot of these programs in the 75 were something along the lines of a lending library or free e-bikes that were given out to a particular group. But we were really interested in these cash subsidy programs because we're starting to see those kind of pop up more regularly here. So this is a quick map of the geographic distribution of the programs that we found. You'll see that most of the programs at this point are kind of concentrated in New England, in Colorado, in California, or in BC. But we're starting to see a trickle of them around the country. Importantly here, right, we're separating out, whether these programs are just proposed or whether they've been activated in some way. And so, for example, like the program in Oklahoma is unlikely to end up, floating to the top here of the legislative session. But programs, in places like New York, or Connecticut, for example, here this last week, we're starting to kind of matriculate through the local legislature a little bit more effectively. So we're starting to see some movement on a number of those like points as well. And since we did the cutoff here for our analysis, because programs have been popping up, every week, we've seen a number of programs pop up here. Importantly, right, there's one locally here in Eugene, Oregon, that just took effect, and then Vermont is looking to pass a statewide program here in the next couple of months as well. North Vancouver's approved program, or North Vancouver's proposed program is now approved, will be going into effect later in the year. And then a number of other states here have done, have proposed a statewide program that's likely to come to fruition here in the near future. We have this whole inventory that we've done available online, and you'll be able to find that at the same link as the white paper. And so we'll share that again with you. But if you're interested in seeing our data or digging into any one of these programs in particular, we've got links and all of it, and a number of the details here pulled out for each of these programs that you can dig into. So for the discount mechanism for these programs, we saw the vast majority of them were providing some cash subsidy using a post-purchase rebate. A good number of them were doing a point of sale discount. And then we caught a variety of other incentive programs that were following some other incentivization model. Like I said, like a free e-bike or a lending library. But we weren't as focused on catching all of these programs. So there may be a number of others that we didn't find in our inventory. A variety of those options are just included here to provide some perspective on the variety of ways that places can go about promoting these bikes. So for the post-purchase rebates, the point of sale incentives, the vast majority of programs determine the amount of money that they would subsidize an e-bike purchase with using a flat rate, meaning that it doesn't matter how expensive the e-bike you're buying is, you're going to receive the same amount of money. A decent portion of them as well use a percentage of purchase price. For example, you might get 25% of the purchase price of the e-bike up to maybe a $900 incentive. And then there was one program which used a percentage of purchase price but did not provide a cap on the website. I imagine in effect they do provide a cap. I couldn't find that information. And then one existing program that uses a sales tax rate. So the incentive amounts varied pretty greatly, but the vast majority fell below $600. In the graphic you're seeing here, the dark bars represent the program that's available to the general public, and the light bars represent programs that are only available to people that qualify by income. And for any programs where there was a general population option and an income qualified option, both of those are represented in this graphic. So if you tally these up, there's more than 37 points on the bar. But yeah, there were a handful of programs that sat up above that $1,200 threshold, the vast majority of which were income qualified or were cargo bike specific. We'll get into that a little bit more later on. Income thresholds were defined in a number of ways. Vast majority of programs that did some sort of income qualification used some sort of existing mechanism to qualify for income, typically by participation in an income qualified program like a renter's assistance or SNAP, or by using the federal poverty guidelines, which are set up by the Department of Health and Human Services and are updated every year based on inflation and reimbursement rates. Management agencies varied program to program, but a large number of them were managed by power districts. And that's largely due to the effects of e-bikes, right? We're offsetting emissions, which can gain power districts tax breaks if they can do so effectively. So there's been a couple of models set up to do so. Local governments likewise have very particular goals that e-bikes can help accomplish, and so they're more willing to take on these programs. We're starting to see a number of nonprofits and advocacy groups step into the landscape, as well as state governments. But these programs are a little bit easier to run if you've got a defined group of people that you're providing a service for, like a city or a power district. And you may have heard news of the e-bike bill that was floated early last year. It's not looking like it'll come to fruition at the moment because it's been rolled into the Build Back Better bill. And I won't comment on the larger political landscape there, right? But if it's become a more complicated than just passing an e-bike bill all of a sudden here. But if this federal bill were to pass, we'd be looking at a 30% rebate for e-bike purchases, capped at $900. But importantly here, the applicable purchase price of an e-bike would be capped at $4,000, which would exclude most cargo bike models from participation. So kind of a worrisome bit of this bill that we'd like to see changed. But that may just be one of the bargaining chips that was kind of thrown into this Build Back Better process. We're seeing that as a result of that. And then, an interesting point in comparison to similar electric vehicle rebates, benefits start to phase out once your income goes above $75,000, where that threshold is much, much higher for electric vehicles. So another interesting bit that I imagine happened in the bargaining process here. Equitable outcomes in these existing programs generally were pursued through income qualification, with a number of programs doing kind of more direct targeting in their programs, but those were typically lending library style or free e-bike style programs rather than these cash subsidies. about a quarter of the programs were income qualified to participate at all, and then around 10% of the programs had an additional option where you could gain an additional incentive if you qualified by income. And so for the rest of the presentation here, I'm going to discuss some best practices that we uncovered, doing a literature review. I'm looking at these programs and talking with program managers, and I'm going to follow this rough structure. And this is available in the white paper if you want to read through it in detail, but this is the rough structure that I'll be following for the rest of the program as well. Great, so first step here, we want to define our guiding principles. So depending on what management agency you're working for that's looking to run this program, you may have different goals that an e-bike can help support, right? And so selecting goals early on that you're going to be able to track and you're going to be able to apply to existing either planning documents or visioning documents from your agency going to be really, really important. And the focus here, overarching, this is an overarching goal for the entirety of the program design. We should be focusing on inducing new purchases that would not have otherwise have happened. Because there's a number of people, out in society, and I'm sure a number of people in this room who are thinking about buying e-bikes already and may not need an incentive to make that decision. So the goal here really is to change people's minds that may not have otherwise bought an e-bike. And there's a number of different ways you can go about that in the program design. And so, of course, part of this then is identifying your target population, especially as we're thinking about those marginal purchases. It's totally acceptable to have a program available to the general public, but you may see kind of more effectiveness if you do some targeting either by income qualification, or by geography, or by providing additional subsidies for people with lower incomes. And this is another great way to kind of think about your agency's equity goals, right? If you've got a group that you're trying to support, you could think about ways to target that population, through your program design. And then importantly, right, we need to talk about what type of e-bikes are going to be included because the options are so broad. We recommend providing for as wide a variety of use cases as possible. So that means including every type of e-bike under the sun if you can. However, that may differ based on your local legislative landscape. Some cities don't allow certain e-bike classes on paths, for example, or in bike lanes. And so that may change your decision on that. And then some programs may have goals of incentivizing e-bikes in order to increase physical activity, in which case a class 2 e-bike, which includes a throttle, may not be appropriate to incentivize. Then it's also important to think about whether or not we're including cargo bikes, because if a price threshold is set, you need to be really careful, much like that federal program, not to price out cargo bikes. And in fact, cargo bikes have a really strong value proposition for replacing vehicle trips. So it may be appropriate to provide additional incentives for those cargo bikes. Retailers, the other big piece of this puzzle, there's, in many communities, right, there's a good number of bike shops to choose from, but there's a whole lot of communities in the US and Canada that don't have good bike shops, particularly when it comes to e-bikes. So the inclusion of online retailers will provide for more choice for the consumers, and again, will provide for more of those different use cases. So really important to consider including both local retailers and online purchases, in the applicability of the program. Incentive amounts, again, here we think that providing more incentives is good. We're biased. And the approach that we've seen that seemed to work very well for a number of people is a targeted universalism approach. The idea here being that you provide more help for people who need more help. In particular for the e-bikes, this means that we are providing additional incentives for people with lower incomes. So you can provide multiple tier levels. We've seen up to 3, different levels of incentives based on different levels of income. And a good way to go about setting your incentive values altogether is doing some sort of local price sensitivity survey or some sort of econometric analysis to figure out, what amount of money is actually going to change people's minds. So the city of Corvallis, for example, sent out a survey to a bunch of their constituents and asked how much they would be willing to pay for a number of e-bike models, and based their incentive value off of that, landed about $1,200. And then you can think about providing incentives, based on the goals that you set. So if your goal is to reduce emissions, you can monetize the changes in greenhouse gas, right? Because as a power district, you're assessed fees in many states for the emissions that you produce. And reducing those fees will provide some savings, right? So this is the model that was followed in Burlington, Vermont, and then by a number of others, where they figured that over the lifetime of an e-bike, it would save them about $300 in fees due to offset carbon emissions. And they passed on about $200 of those savings to consumers. And then providing a flat rebate is another way to pursue a more equitable program here, because the amount that you receive from the program funding is then not contingent on your ability to pay more upfront for an e-bike. And then as we look to define process here, the point of purchase rebate is again another great way to pursue more equitable outcomes, because again we're not asking the consumer to pay more money upfront than they would need to. Because if there's any delay in providing that rebate, either through a tax liability, rebate, or through some sort of post-purchase mail-in rebate, the consumer is going to need to carry that liability for longer than they would if there was a point of purchase subsidy that they were receiving. Income verification can be a hurdle for a lot of places because typically this will need to be done on a case-by-case basis. But using a third party to help assist with that, like I said, by using some sort of low income program as your income qualification could be really, really helpful. Or just by partnering with a community organization that may already have this information on the potential participants, that may help, that may save some administrative hurdles down the line. And then simplifying the application process is great for both program managers and for the consumers, especially if you can keep it as online as possible. Of course, while maintaining paper or phone options for folks who may have low internet access. Strategic partners are going to be really important to program success as well. Like I said, those community organizations are going to be able to help with administration, but also with outreach and with identification of potential recipients. Local bike shops, likewise, are going to be able to help with outreach events. They'll be able to provide bikes for demos and be able to help communicate the benefits of e-bikes a little bit more directly. Financial institutions may help with moving funds around or helping constituents navigate any sort of financial landscape that they have to deal with here. And then academic institutions or other researchers may be more than willing to help with program administration, program planning, or with assessment after the facts. And so, partners really, they can be leveraged at any point in this process. And the overarching idea here is that you can use these partners to make it easier for people to first try the e-bikes and then to get on them, right? And to know the benefits and to learn how to use them. Lots and lots of great folks that are more than happy to help us in this goal. Okay, so as we administer the program, it's really important to track our metrics. In particular, right, we're looking to solicit feedback both from participants and from administrators. It's unlikely that the chasm of e-bike adoption here is going to be bridged within the first couple months of the program, and so it's likely that there's going to be a second or third iteration of this program down the line. So really important that we're soliciting feedback so it can be made better each time we renew. You can consider, as a program branding as a pilot. That may make it easier to float your program in the legislature if it's seen as a temporary thing or as a small scale thing, just because of the use of the word pilot. However, that may make it harder to renew further down the line. So should be taken with consideration based on the local landscape. And then we hear a lot of concerns regarding fraud or recreational use of the e-bikes, because typically your goals are dependent on the fact that the e-bike is replacing car trips being used for utilitarian purposes. So recreational use could throw a wrench in that. And we also hear concerns about receipt by unintended groups, like college students or other people who may not stay in the area for a long time. Because we tend to think about these benefits of e-bikes on 5 to 10 year scale, so college students may not be helpful in those ends. However, we typically see that most of these concerns aren't warranted as they're evaluated after the fact. In Corvallis or in Saanich, BC, for example, right? These are college towns with a pretty strong student population. The vast majority of the program recipients are lower income, older folks that are in the area who are returning to cycling after some time. But again, here on all these concerns, evaluation is key more than prevention, because, like we said, not a huge concern here, at least based off what we've seen so far. So again, looking at program evaluation, we're just going to synthesize that feedback. And it's important to kind of start with the end in mind. So as we're doing program planning and participant recruitment, doing some sort of an intake survey as well as follow-up surveys can be a really great way to get some longitudinal data as far as travel patterns and use of the e-bike. One option that a number of programs have made is that they'll provide additional incentives for people that opt in to do some sort of tracking of use, either with a GPS device or the trip diary. And And then, after the fact here, right, we can evaluate those concerns that we talked about in the previous slide. And this is, during the program evaluation phase, it's a great time to think about program longevity, because some of these feedback components, may help to either support or diminish the value statement that was made for the program upfront. So the question I've gotten most often here, talking with folks about this project, is which programs should I look at, as good models today? So I'm going to talk about 3 of them. I've mentioned Corvallis a number of times. This is a program that provides a fairly large incentive value that's restricted by income to 80% of the county median. The price was set using a local price sensitivity survey, which is the only program that I can say I've seen has done so. And this is kind of what we're starting to think of as best practice, right? Because it really gets to the heart of what's important here in incentivizing new purchases, right? Asking people what amount of money would change their mind, and then giving them that much. And then importantly, right, it's a point of purchase distribution here as well. So makes it easier for those folks who, maybe on the lower end of the income scale to, go ahead and purchase these bikes without carrying that liability themselves. San HBC, right, this is the program that's used that targeted universalism approach most directly. They have 3 different income tiers. They're starting at a fairly low incentive value and finishing at a fairly high incentive value, right? So again, we're helping the folks that need help the most with the most help. And again, right, a point of purchase discount, lowering those barriers to use. And they use their price setting rather than with a local survey, with an econometric analysis that was done through UBC by some professors up there. But again, looking at some sort of analysis that determines what amount of money would actually be useful. Then Denver, Colorado, again, providing smaller subsidies to the general public and larger subsidies to income qualified participants. Importantly, this is the first program we've seen that has really specifically broken out cargo bikes and provided some definition for what a cargo bike is. Because if we think about our earlier slide, right, those cargo bikes may not look too different on paper, from the other types of e-bike, and it may be difficult to draw a line between the two. But Denver took a stab at it, and has a definition that I've got up here. It's also included in the white paper, so I won't read through it now. So what's next for us? As we said, best way to go about incentive pricing, we think, is by doing some sort of a sensitivity survey. So the next step for John and I and our partners here is to do a national level preference survey here to figure out what amount of money actually gets people to change their mind on making an e-bike purchase. So we're really curious about rebate method, whether that's an effective, or whether the difference in rebate method helps change minds. The incentive amount, of course, and then any sort of external cultural or environmental factors, as well as your demographics. So we'll be collecting a whole lot of information about people's location, and the setting that they exist in, including whether or not they need to use stairs to access their home, which may be a detriment if your bike weighs over 50 pounds. And we think this is important because there hasn't been a really wide scale survey like this done to date that we're aware of. The one in Corvallis was really just a number, it was 35 odd people in Corvallis itself. So not super useful to the nation at large. Great, that's all I've got for you. Like I said, the QR code for the white paper is here. All the resources can be found on that page. So if there's anything here you want to revisit, it's the place to do so. Thank you.
All right, time for questions and answers, including people in the room who can just raise your hand and ask a question instead of typing it in the box. We do have some online. But I will first, is there anyone anxious in the room? Yes, question in the room. And I think if you speak loudly enough, folks online will hear it.
Okay, great. So thank you for the wonderful presentation. As you were talking about incentive programs, it occurred to me that have you looked into incentive programs coupled with like bike loan programs where banks are providing like loans to people who want to purchase a new bike, and what that would look like? Because maybe perhaps that would help make these bikes more affordable to the people who really need them.
Yeah, so in our incentive program scan, we found a number of programs that did something similar. Most of them administered through private entities. So for example, Google's got a program for their corporate office that has an e-bike lending library, and then provides incentives after participation in the lending library if you choose to purchase a bike. And then there's a number of smaller scale programs that had a lending library with a purchase option. So the bike that you borrowed, you have the option to purchase it afterwards. And then I know in Vermont, there's a statewide lending library that moves around every couple months. That's also supported by a number of local and now a statewide incentive program for purchases. But this is one of the things that we recommended in our future research, to look into more because we're not super certain about all the dynamics there.
One additional aspect is bring up is in Europe, there is one program for sure, but maybe two around ride to own. So, the more you ride it, they will, provide more of a subsidy to purchase it and even purchase it fully for you. So that could be another way in which, the entity actually pays the full way if you use it to reduce your car trip.
All right, so I've got at least one question. And more in the, okay, I'm going to go there, but I encourage all of you online, type your questions into the Q&A box since we do have time to get to them. And I'm going to go first, closer up front.
So excellent presentation. Thank you so much. I like your suggestion of opening up the vendors to being online retailers in addition to brick and mortar stores. My question is, what mechanisms have you seen in terms of reimbursing those retailers? Because in my mind, it could be more difficult to work with a pretty widespread online retailer compared to a local shop to get them the money. So maybe to give the money directly to the participant, I'm not really sure how these work.
Yeah.
Okay. I'm not sure if the people online could hear that question. So if you could just quickly summarize it.
Yeah. So the question was, basically how are we interacting with those online retailers as a program? In particular, if we're looking at, a point of sale discount, those retailers will need to be reimbursed by the entity running the program. And so I guess what I'll say is that I'm not aware of any programs that are providing point of sale discounts with online retailers. They tend to be post-purchase rebates, right? So I'll send in the receipt from the online retailer and then receive a rebate check in the mail a couple of weeks later, which cuts out any money that needs to move through that online retailer.
Okay. One more question in the room, and then I'm going to do online, and then I'll go to you.
Yeah, I was just curious about the relationship between a potential point of sale discount with income verification. Were there programs where somebody could actually walk in on that day and get an income verified rebate, or what the kind of timeframes were like, and if there were any solutions that you found?
Yeah, so
making sure that local people could kind of access that on the point of sale.
Yeah, so the question.
They can hear.
They can
I
hear.
just
We're good.
double
Okay.
checked. We're fine.
Awesome. So the workaround that we've seen that's been fairly popular is a point of sale discount with an application, right? So you become pre-qualified for the program by submitting an application that includes income verification, or whatever other program criteria are involved. And then you take that verification letter to a participating local retailer who will then provide the point of purchase discount. Alternatively, right, you can provide vouchers that are good, like a gift card essentially for local bike shops. As a workaround for that.
All right, so we had a question that came in early online, I think when John was presenting some data, but I think it applies to the incentive issue as well, which is what about e-bike conversions? And how might they fit into this whole landscape?
Yeah, some programs allow e-bike conversion kits to be applied to program funding. However, typically at a lower tier, there's a number of programs that provide a smaller incentive for conversion kits because they are cheaper than an e-bike. But more programs than not prohibit their use, for program funding.
Question in the room.
Yeah, so thank you for your presentation. So I was wondering, through your research, were you able to realize which method finds the more optimal incentive breakdown, like a survey or like an econometric analysis? Because I can see, shortcomings for both, where if the econometric analysis is based off sales data, then only certain people are buying e-bikes, but if it's a survey, only certain people are taking the survey. So I guess which one finds the more optimal incentive?
Yeah, that's part of the next phase of our research is looking to answer that question. Largely because like I said, the survey in Corvallis was 35 odd people, And I can't name any other programs that did a similar survey. So we've got a really small sample size for what we're looking at here. And then the econometric analysis from UBC, I think, has only been really applied directly in Saanich. And so again, really small sample size. We're talking, less than 200 incentives altogether that have really been used, using either of these methods.
And for currently, the way in which most incentive programs have been set is basically, we have X amount of dollars. And what sounds like a good incentive, or let's have 1,000 people get the incentive and they just divide the total amount of money. So like, it's not necessarily based on any kind of research that they had done. And one of the reasons we started this project is looking at that gap, that there needs to be more, even once we've done our survey, it will be only one, data point, and there'll probably be more information that needs. And as Cameron mentioned, the evaluation is so important for these type of programs, not only so that they can kind of double check who is actually purchasing them and how the incentives are working, but that aspect of showing proof so that you can sustain funding long-term is really important, in that there's not a narrative like only rich people are buying these bikes for, mountain bike, e-bikes. So like, you need that information to continually show proof of concept.
Thank you.
All right, I'm gonna do a question online from Phil Winters. Hello, Phil. Nice for you to join in. Are there discussions or efforts underway about changing federal laws allowing employers to subsidize e-bikes or employees to use pre-tax income to purchase e-bikes under IRS's qualified transportation fringe benefits, which those benefits currently are limited to transit parking and van at $280 a month?
Not aware of anything.
That was in the most recent bill, the better bill that didn't pass, I think. And so at the federal level, they are trying to do that. I think Earl Blumeyer has been leading that effort to try to get both those incentive, employer-based incentive to be included, but that e-bikes would be included as part of that employer incentive. So yes.
Yeah, because there was a more generic question here about if there's pathways for distributing incentives via employers. And in your examples of like pilot projects, did you see any employer-based?
Yeah, there's 3 that we're aware of that there was, any amount of detail available for. The program that I mentioned at Google being the one, for which there's been any sort of academic, assessment of the program. Recent. There's kind of a large scale, survey and assessment of that program that came out earlier this year. And then there's a program run at a university in Canada, which I'm forgetting off the top of my head now. And then Amazon has a similar program to Google's that's available to its corporate employees, but there's basically no information available about it. There is, however, there's a consulting firm in California called Bikes Make Life Better, who runs e-bike library and e-bike purchase incentive programs on behalf of large corporate clients. So there's a whole landscape of these programs out there that we just don't have a lot of insight to.
Nathan, question.
Yeah, I'm curious about whether any of the incentive programs take into, or are they based on households or individuals first, and then or did they take into account household size or the kind of the number of people that would be using it, like so maybe a couple would both be using it, or if they were carrying children.
Yeah, typically the programs are limited by household, so you can claim 1 or 2 rebates per household. And then those federal poverty guidelines are stratified by household size. So your low income threshold increases as your household size increases. But yeah, no stratification based on potential buyers that I've seen.
And one thing we did mention in the presentation, one of the big programs to look for is California. So the Air Resource Board is rolling out a incentive program, $10 million. But that's for the whole state. So it sounds big, but then when you think of California, it becomes kind of small. But they are just in the RFP process to kind of develop what that looks like. And they're going to have a very strong component on low-income households. So it'll be interesting to see how they parse out that, qualification, and also how they manage it, because it's going to be probably statewide. It's not going to be like regionally focused in the first stages. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. And I think, we should hear late May, June about that program.
All right, I've got some more online questions, and if you're putting questions in the chat, I can only monitor one thing at a time, so put them in the Q&A box. So a question about monetizing the externalities. Are you aware of data or tools for calculating the monetary value of the safety benefits of e-bikes versus motor vehicles, or even just broadly data on that?
Yeah, we've kind of started looking at the public health impacts of e-bikes from a variety of different perspectives. The safety benefits, especially in the US, are not very well quantified right now. So this is a really potent area for future research. There's some indication that and the argument here that we like to float more often for these e-bikes is that more cyclists on the road generally promotes a higher rate of safety for cyclists, right? So you'll see it's a nonlinear relationship between number of cyclists on the road and number of cyclist injuries. And it's called the safety in numbers effect. And so despite whether or not e-bikes may be more dangerous as a tool to be used, we think that the safety in numbers benefit outweighs that. So the higher speeds, right, of course, do provide additional danger for the e-bikes, especially if we're looking at class 3s. And a number of state laws require helmet use. By particular e-bike classes typically require helmets for class 3 bikes just because of that higher speed.
Right. Okay, so another online question. So speaking of rebate size determined by program funding, have program funding structures been evaluated? Are these rebate, I think these are related questions. Are these rebate programs typically funded by annual budget allocations, state grants, what other sources, or were you able to determine that?
It's a big variety for all these programs. Typically, it's greenhouse gas related funding sources, like clean fuels funding or gas taxes that kind of get passed through a variety of mechanisms, down to these state and local governments. But yeah, it does vary from place to place, and we do see some private funding sources, right? A number of nonprofit agencies that run programs with grant money that they've received through whatever streams. So really, it varies program to program.
All right. Question in the room.
One of the hangups that I've noticed when doing income followed by tiering and things like that is the handling privately identifiable information. So I'm curious if you've observed any best practices for how to handle that without employer requests and potential problems.
Third-party partnerships is really the key here, right? Because there's
So maybe that one, do we need to repeat that one? Repeat
Okay.
that question.
Yeah, so the question was income verification process, typically will require some collection of personally identifiable information or sensitive information, and what are potential workarounds here. And so one typical workaround is using participation in some income qualified program, like SNAP or like a renter's assistance program that is as simple as showing a card, right? That may not include any personally identifiable information. Or partnering with a third party, right? So working through some sort of community organization that already may be housing this data, so that incentive program managers don't need to collect and process that data themselves. And both of these mechanisms help with administrative overhead as well, but it takes away a task for the program administrators. And then the Corvallis Oregon program actually issues their incentives, their income restricted incentives on an honor basis. And their reasoning for doing so was that that may help to avoid any sort of humiliation from having to prove how poor you are. And maybe a useful model for programs with particular community types, right? That opens a door to fraud. But again, we haven't seen huge issues with fraud as a whole. So depending on what your community looks like and your concerns as a program manager, that may be an option.
Yeah, and the other thing just to add is that you're trying to limit the amount of effort and also issues that local bike shops have traditionally never had to deal with, right? So if you're putting that type of verification onto them, they might not want to participate because they either don't have the system to deal with it, or they're not comfortable with dealing with it. So trying to create a system that allows the partnership with, particularly with the seller of the bike, to not have to be in charge of verifying income is really important.
All right. Okay. So I have one comment online to add to this. Some utility questions handle income verification by allowing self-certification and then subsequently audit a sample. So that might be an option. I have one question online, but let me do this in person and then we'll do the online, and then I think we're going to be done.
Yeah, so my question relates to bike share programs. So Portland obviously has e-bikes, pretty much everywhere in bikes now, whereas like out in New York, they don't, but more like convenient. So do you think that bike sharing programs help expose the general population to e-bikes, right? Because e-bikes are kind of scary, and the kind of people able to get on the bike and ride around. Does that help with adoption overall?
So good question. I will summarize the question, which is the observation that a lot of bike share programs now have e-bikes, and wondering if that sort of exposes people to the idea of e-bikes, perhaps might help that behavior change to getting their own e-bike.
Almost certainly yes, but we don't know. This is one of our recommended areas for research, right? Anecdotally, the most convincing argument for buying an e-bike is trying one, because they're wicked fun to ride. And so the e-bike, share programs provide that sort of a value, but we don't have any quantified evidence to really show one way or the other.
And I'll add that two things. One, all bike share programs should be e-bikes. There should be, like, it basically breaks down so many barriers of accessibility and inclusivity that bike shares can to help more people use the system. But another benefit it can do is there is still this kind of perception that e-bike riders and e-bike use is unsafe, right? And so the more people that are using e-bikes that we can show in the community that are using it for bike share, it helps other people that are not using bike but using the facilities that, hey, that Biketown bike just went by me and it was totally fake. It wasn't going that much faster than I was, or is not, riding, irrationally, or, and I think that adds to the better understanding of how e-bikes can be used in the community.
I'm going to do the online question, so we get that in before our end time, and then we can still do questions in the room. Great presentation. Any observations or thoughts on incorporation of after-sales service and maintenance into programs, given that people buying e-bikes might have nearly zero experience with power systems and are going to need help at some point, and it's not always straightforward to get an e-bike serviced or repaired? So is anything being done, or do you think something should be done?
Yeah, so a couple different ways that you could go about this. Of course, local bike shops, right, are going to be able to service the models that they sell. And a consideration, when looking at e-bikes, is that the service for e-bikes typically doesn't mean opening up the motor and doing electrical engineering work. It means dropping the motor out and putting a new one in when something goes wrong. Similar to most other bike mechanic work. It's not a lot of fixing; it's a lot of replacing. And so, bike shops can be easily trained to run these systems, but there isn't a whole lot of standardization in the industry to date. So, there is a lot of differences bike to bike. And then incorporating direct to consumer models. So, these companies like Rad Power Bikes or like Van Moof that sell bikes online straight to their consumers also will provide pretty high-end customer service and on-call service for the bikes as part of their business model, right? Because that's essential for those business models to be able to function. So in program design, right, including explicitly those online stores that are going to be able to provide some level of service as well may help to bridge those barriers. But of course, this is a huge concern, the service concern, in communities that may not have good access to bike shops. Considerations change there a whole lot. But again, like the online retailers help bridge those gaps because they'll come to where the bike is, or they'll email it back to where it gets serviced.
It's really important, and we've been talking between us about this issue about total cost of ownership, and is that an issue? I mean, one of the reasons why that local bike shop is really important, or a company that's online but can provide local service, like Rad has a van that can come up to your house and do maintenance, or you can take it to a location, is really important. But I think often we and there is a cost to own anything for periods of time. They break down, you need a replacement, all that stuff. But I find it interesting that people bring this up with bikes, but with the EV incentives or other type of cars, your total cost of ownership is way more than you would have with a bike. And also with EVs, it's going to be costly to fix or replace the car over a 10-year period. So it's interesting. There's definitely more information that needs to be gathered, like how long batteries last, the cost of replacing batteries or a motor, and that type of stuff. So it is important to think about.
We are at 12:30. I'm going to do the end, but I do want to at least recognize the folks online. We recognize if you need to leave because we are at 12:30. But since we're in person, we're going to finish up our questions in the room.
So I have a question related to how is there information about incentives getting out to different communities? Because low-income communities might not have access to the internet, or is it door to door? Is it in person? Did you do any research on that?
Yeah, we didn't do any kind of particular tallying of outreach methods, but there's been some kind of through community organizations, some really targeted efforts, either through employers or through like housing complexes, right? If there's a particular group that you're trying to catch. And then, typical outreach methods that may be done by a city for any sort of incentive program, right? Doing email blasts, or the mailers, right? Typical for these kind of city and municipality-based programs.
I think it's a huge aspect to these programs, particularly ones that you have an equity focus, long-term focus, in that are the programs sufficiently funding the outreach side of things? Just because you have an incentive and a bike shop can put up a sign saying we have incentive, that doesn't mean you're hitting the right people. And for particularly communities that don't have that many bike shops, and they may have to go 5-10 miles to a bike shop, how would they know about that? And so it is a really important part of when you're developing your program, and as in one of the sections that Cameron presented on, is that understanding of outreach and how you're thinking about it, who's doing that, who's partnering in it, how are you funding that, is really important for the success of these. But we haven't really seen that much because one, these programs are just coming in fruition, like the Vermont program or the California program. And so there's not a lot of data on the effectiveness of outreach.
All right. Ooh, another question.
Yeah, I had a question. If we're looking at e-bikes from a greenhouse gases perspective, is there any path where you see some people taking the e-bikes to start and then moving to a traditional bike?
Yeah, I mean, definitely, right? Because the e-bikes are fun, and that they convince you to ride a bike. But that's not a dynamic that we've looked at here super closely. So not aware of how prevalent that is.
And once you go electric, it's hard to go back. I have to speak for myself. I'm like, I don't know. I like my electric bike.
Because certainly your earlier research has shown that the opposite often happens, particularly as people get older and may have, aches in their joints and some other mobility limitations. That transition from a regular bike to an e-bike can work really well. I'm going to bring our formal to a close because I know we need to close but because we are in person, we have time to continue chatting afterwards. But I'm going to do the official closing, and I want all of you who are online, I want to encourage you to do our quick survey afterwards so we can get some feedback from you. And remind you that if you are not signed up for our newsletter, please do, so you can hear more about our future seminars and webinars. And thank all of you who attended both virtually and in person. And with that, I think we are ending the meeting.